Hello and welcome to Motorsport Speak, the motorsport podcast brought to you by Motorsport Week and motorsportmonday.com. My name's Dan Lawrence, and as ever to talk all things Formula 1, I'm joined by our editor Taylor Powling. And we're here to discuss the Monaco Grand Prix. And at long last, Charles Leclerc ended his curse. Well, he said he doesn't believe in the curse, but there was a Monaco curse stopping him from winning his home race, but no more. The Monegasque driver was victorious at his home circuit, which was a very popular win. But the race itself was less than entertaining, which I guess we've all become used to in recent years in Formula 1. But let's talk all about it. Taylor, first, how are you? And second, did you enjoy the race?
Hi Dan, I'm good, thanks. As you put it was a very processional race, always is at Monaco, especially with these generation of cars that are bigger and wider and just heavier. So the action, we weren't expecting much, but usually around the pit stops at Monaco there is some action. You always have that chance of a red flag or a safety car coming at the optimum moment for certain drivers and spicing it up. But as I'm sure we'll get into, that was curtailed by the early red flag, which nullified any strategy from happening, and it would have been hard to stomach as a race if it had been another Verstappen walkover. But the fact that we had a new Monaco race win and it was the home hero made it that little bit easier to, watch the whole 78 laps and stomach that 30-minute stoppage at the start.
Yes, I think if that race had been combined with a Verstappen victory, then I think we all would have been less than pleased. But yes, you mentioned the first lap chaos. It was chaos indeed. So Sergio Perez found himself towards the back of the field. He qualified 18th, or he set the 18th fastest time, I should say, in qualifying. So he was a shock Q1 exit, but he actually qualified 16th because the two Haas cars were disqualified from Saturday's session because of a non-compliant DRS. So that meant at the race start, Perez had a eager Kevin Magnussen behind him. I think that's fair to say. On the Beau Rivage, Perez was unaware that Magnussen was having a little look on the right-hand side at his rear, squeezed slightly to the right-hand wall. Magnussen didn't back off. They touched. There was a violent spin from Perez's car. Haas and Red Bull bits of bodywork flying everywhere, and poor old Nico Hülkenberg also got caught up in it. That was the first incident on the opening lap. Well, actually second, because Sainz further up the field tagged Piastri and got that puncture and pulled aside. And then later around the lap, we also had the clash of the Alpines. Esteban Ocon being a bit of a naughty boy and sticking up the inside Pierre Gasly on the entrance to the tunnel, or the corner that leads to the tunnel, and they came together. Esteban Ocon went up in the air, came clattering down, and that was his race run. Gasly was angry. Bruno Faman, Alpine team boss, was very angry, and Ocon was apologetic. So there was a lot to sort of sink our teeth into in that first lap, and there was obviously a red flag. But let's go through each situation one by one, starting with Perez and Magnussen, which wasn't investigated, which I think we were all surprised about on the Motorsport Week team, given the fact that Magnussen has that 2 points away on his licence from a race ban, and it wasn't looked into. And you could arguably say, and I would portion more of the blame on Magnussen in that incident, because Perez is unsighted, Magnussen's barely alongside a rear wheel, the gap's closing, you know what's going to happen if you keep going, and he didn't back out. So I think it was a bit needless from Magnussen. But yeah, let me get your take on that first lap one incident.
Yeah, I'm with you completely on, if you were to apportion the blame to anyone, it would be Magnussen, because Perez is unsighted. But I think the stewards took into account that it's Monaco, it's lap one, and also the nature of the circuit going at Beau Rivage, because the barrier actually tightens. So as Magnussen was going for the gap, the wall's coming in closer, the gap's closing, and that was what made a collision inevitable. Magnussen should have had the foresight to back out, because at the end of the day, it's not Perez's prerogative to open up the gap unless Magnussen is sufficiently alongside, which he wasn't. But from Magnussen's point of view, I can also see why he made the move. Both Haas cars have been disqualified. He was a bit incensed that he had to abandon his lap in Q2, which he thinks could have got him through to Q3. So he probably was running on, a bit of a temper that weekend. And yeah, I mean, it wasn't the worst incident in the world. The actual impact and the outcome, I think, was worse than the touch. And the most, unfortunate party in that incident, you'd have to say, is Hulkenberg, because he wasn't even involved in the collision and he spied a gap to get through the chaos, and Perez's spinning Red Bull across the track ended up tagging his rear, and that was him out, and that was Haas's day done, and it spoke volumes that Haas's photos after the race were all on the grid because they didn't get very far.
No, they did not. Yes. I mean, you could play devil's advocate there. You say, obviously, lap 1 Monaco, but Ocon was penalised, which we'll get onto in a minute. But also, I think with Magnussen, there's being eager to make up lost ground, but then there's also the fact that you're starting from the back of the grid at Monaco. A points finish is really, I don't know. I think you're right in saying that probably the energy in the impact made the driver action look worse than it was. I think it's important to note that obviously a lot of loose carbon fibre from that, there's been videos on social media, which I think everybody's seen now, flew over like the catch fencing, and photographers had to sort of flee from the scene. And I think one photographer was injured slightly from a loose piece of, be it Red Bull or Haas, but was luckily escaped any sort of major harm. So that's good. But that kind of highlights the dangers in motorsport despite the safety advancements that we've had. But yes, that triggered the red flag, which meant that Carlos Sainz got a very lucky break, because obviously he came into contact with Piastri on the first start, because trying to sort of, I guess, get into second and further protect Leclerc. And then he pulled off with a puncture at turn 4, the right-hander. But the red flag reset the order as it was as they started, so Sainz was able to get away with that sort of mishap scot-free and start again in third. And I think McLaren were a bit incensed by that, because Piastri came away with some side pod and floor damage from that contact, and so he had that sort of that lingering on his car for the 78 lap race. Meanwhile, Sainz, who had his part to play in that incident, got away with it potentially. What's your sort of take on that?
I think it was just one of those incidents that was fairly innocuous. I mean, it was even hard to see if there was a touch, even on the replays from my point of view. It was very minor, and you can't hold anyone accountable. It was just how tight Sandoval is, and they had a glance on the exit, and I'd imagine 9 times out of 10, Sainz gets away with that contact there. It just so happened that on this occasion he did get a puncture, which you could kind of tell there was something wrong when he was climbing up the hill, because he was going at a reduced speed. And then as he tried to steer into Casino Square, the car just wouldn't comply with his steering movements, and that looked to be his race then until the red flag. There's been a lot of divided opinion about whether Sainz should have inherited or been reinstated back to third. Both the McLaren team boss Andrea Stella and Lando Norris said that it was unfair. Stella also pointed out that Sainz was lucky to not get a penalty for impeding Albon in qualifying. So yeah, McLaren were a bit incensed that they could have a double podium at Monaco. Alonso also flagged that maybe the red flag rules could be revised. I think Verstappen was asked about it. He was a bit more, circumspect and saying that it happens. And then Fred Verstappen put it best, where regardless, through the history of F1 and especially the Monaco Grand Prix, you've always had red flag periods that have influenced the race. And in Sainz's case, he was the beneficiary on this occasion, but next time he might be the one that isn't. So just because it went for him this time doesn't mean it'll go for him another time. And I think whoever gets the decision is going to be saying that the rule's fine, the regulations are used as they're written, and then the ones that, feel hard done by, they're going to complain. So I think you can't really make a rule in that case that makes everyone happy, because it's always a moving goalpost based on the decision and who benefits and who doesn't.
Yes, I think, you're exactly right. If it had been McLaren in Sainz's situation and they hadn't been reinstated third place, then they would have been up in arms, wouldn't they? So it's always trying to fight your corner and try and get an advantage any way you can. And obviously the way they've reset the order is because the race stewards, it's the last point they could determine the field and the actual order of the cars, and they couldn't figure that out. So they just sort of reverted, didn't they? For safety car line 1, wasn't it?
Yeah, because Joe Guan Yu was the one that hadn't passed safety car line 2 because he was stuck behind he had a slow start and he was stuck behind the collision further down the hill. So, yeah, I mean, people asked for the FI to, subscribe to their own regulations and apply the rules correctly. They do so, and they're getting criticised. There's a rule book in place. They followed it. As I said, it's happened before at Monaco. Sometimes it goes for you, sometimes it doesn't go for you, and that's just how it is. We're always going to have these complaints about, I think, red flags and starting grid procedures.
Yeah. You talked about rule books there. The unofficial rule book of teammate engagement starts with big bold lettering. Don't hit your teammate. Esteban Ocon, rightly or wrongly, has been labelled as a driver that potentially isn't very good at following that rule, and he sort of proved that in Monaco with his tangle with Gasly. And yes, I think it was a rash manoeuvre. I think that's probably fair to say. And it turns out, I think this is the thing for me, and I imagine this is why Bruno Fernand was so cross, and obviously why Pierre Gasly was cross, and why Ocon ended up being apologetic for his opportunistic move, is that Alpine had discussed in their pre-race briefing that the driver who qualified ahead, which was Gasly, doing a really good job to get into Q3 in 10th, they were to be protected and aided in strategy by the driver behind, which is Ocon. So for then Ocon to just go, oh, you know what, there's half a gap opening up here, and to just try and send it on his teammate, which even if he'd have pulled it off, would have completely thrown out the door the plan that they had in their pre-race briefing. So even then, that would have probably been looked upon a bit like, not very favourably. But he didn't pull it off. They came together and he almost ended both of their races, and he did end his own race. So yes, a bit of a silly manoeuvre from Ocon there. And there's even rumour that Alpine are so cross with him that they might even bench him for the Canadian Grand Prix next time out, which personally I think is not the correct way forward, because then just in talking about harmony and for it's a long season, I feel like you don't want that hanging over you. But yes, that's me sinking my teeth into that one. How about yourself, sir?
Yeah, I think you summarised it well. I've wrote an article for the website that would have gone up by the time you're hearing this podcast. Ocon's completely to blame. I think I've seen people bring up Miami when Gasly pushed Ocon towards the barrier on the first lap, and they narrowly avoided contact there, and that could have prevented Ocon from landing his sole point this season in that race. But the key difference is, as you touched on, is Gasly revealed that there was a pre-race agreement that the driver ahead would, be allowed to stay ahead, and the guy behind would kind of be like a rear gunner. And although it transpired that they were fighting over 10th place or comes out the point because of the red flag that transpired, it was actually at the time a battle for 9th. They were both in the points. So Ocon's lunge, it was opportunistic, and if it was unlike another car, you'd be hailing him for it, because he took advantage of Gasly being slow behind Albon after they battled through the Lowe's hairpin, and he went up the inside when there was a gap. But when it's on your teammate, and you're in Alpine's predicament where they've not scored many points this season, they'd only scored 1 coming into the race, they've qualified well on a track that's difficult to overtake on, and Ocon friend throw that all away with a needless dive at the inside of his teammate, and it ultimately took him out the race, and then I'll put him in the predicament where he could even miss a race. as you said, it would be the wrong thing to do, because at the end of the day, if you bench him for one race, what's his morale going to be like for the rest of the season? It could nosedive. I mean, there's talks that he's looking to leave anyway. In conversations with Haas, maybe even Williams, over a 2025 seat. So it looks like his time with the team coming to an end regardless. But when it's such a long season, there's still 16 more rounds, 15 after Canada, and Alpine need all the help they can get to try and get back in that fight with RB for sixth in the constructor. Sorry. And Ocon's been their best performing driver this season as well. So why would you risk, over one incident that happened between teammates? Okay, it's not the first time, but I think it's the first time where you could say Ocon's actually to blame, because you had Gasly in Australia last year and Gasly in Miami this year. So with Ocon, this is Ocon's kind of first clash with Gasly where he was at fault. They still got a point. I'm sure he'll heed the warning given to him. There's no need to give him a race suspension, especially when the replacement would be Jack Doohan, someone who's not raced since November in F2, doesn't look up to the level of being an F1 full-time driver, unless, of course, Fanman's got his eyes set on Doohan replacing Ocon, in which case it would be a nice little coincidence if they could use this as an excuse to put Ocon on the sidelines and see how Doohan stacks up in a race weekend environment.
Yes, I mean that is a theory, isn't it? But I feel like if you want to assess Jack Doohan's capability for a race seat next season, you keep testing him in the 2022 car, and then you maximise his FP1 outings, like Haas is doing with Oliver Behrman. I don't think you bench your best chance at getting points in Canada. Potentially also that Mick Schumacher could be an option. But again, I don't think Mick Schumacher's at the level that Esteban Ocon's at as a Formula 1 driver, especially with his time out of the sport. Excuse me. Yes. A messy situation, and I guess Alpine won't really have to worry about it next season, because it looks like at least one of those drivers probably won't be there. Moving on. The lengthy stoppage meant that we had a restart, and it also gave teams the opportunity to switch tyres and effectively have a pit stop in the red flag period, which, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the rule that Fernando Alonso wants changed?
Yes. He said he'd be open to it because it happened a few times at Monaco. If you remember, actually, going back to 2011, he was in I believe, a free car fight at the front with Jenson Button and Sebastian Vettel, and Vettel was on really worn tyres and struggling to keep the two behind him. And then a crash with going through the back markers prompted a red flag that allowed Vettel to change and comfortably win the race in the end. So there is a precedent that it happens at Monaco, and in this case it did kind of, nullify any strategy variance, and even George Russell thought he could have won the race if the cards felt right for him. Bit optimistic, but there you go. But yeah, long story short, Alonso said he would be open to the rule changing. Whether it will, probably a discussion point, but I don't think it would. I think it's one of those things where you kind of have to let it fly when it happens, and because it is very minimal when it does happen. There's not too many occasions where, there's been more red flags in recent seasons. It's still around most racetracks, because they're open and they're conventional circuits, you'll still get fighting after it, whereas Monaco is an exception where it did literally kill the race there and then.
Yeah, I think that it's part of a wider discussion, isn't it? Obviously, the Monaco race was not exciting. The fact that there was a red flag on the first lap meant that we then, when we got going again on lap 3, I think they counted as lap 3, the restart, it just meant everybody was managing their pace for the entire race, and everybody was going super slow. You had Max Verstappen on the radio saying he was going to fall asleep. Alex Albon post-race saying he could have gone faster on his Vespa. Yes, drivers were... It was the management Grand Prix, not the Monaco Grand Prix, and that didn't make for an enthralling spectacle. But yes, it's part of a wider discussion is Monaco too boring? Do we need to change things? Does the circuit need changing? Do we need to introduce a mandatory 3 pit stop rule? Do we need to change red flag tyre rules? On the fly, you could say maybe if there's a red flag within, a small amount of laps, say 1, 2, 3 laps, then they're not allowed to change tyres because nothing's really happened. But that's a long, lengthy debate, which I'm not sure we can come up with a solution for. But should we talk about teams and how they got on?
Yes, that sounds good.
Yes. And the way the race ended up was with Ferrari on top and Charles Leclerc on top. So let's talk about them first. Leclerc, I guess, finally delivered on his Monaco promise. And this was one thing that popped into my mind whilst we were watching the weekend unfold. Obviously, being Monegasque and being a Formula One driver, there's just so much sort of riding on his success at the circuit. But it dawned on me that I found, like, wouldn't it have been funny if he'd came into Formula One and just been absolutely naff at Monaco? That would have been, a sorry story. But that's not the case, because he's been a pole sitter twice before this weekend. He was pole sitter on Saturday and just dominant in practice, especially FP2 and FP3, topping those sessions. And basically untroubled on his way to the checkered flag to take, I think, a very popular win, a very emotional win, paying tribute to his late father, who sadly passed during his Formula 2 campaign. The Prince of Monaco was in tears. I think, obviously, the Ferrari team were jubilant, and most of the paddock, I think, was happy with that win. And just good for Leclerc to be on the top step again, because it's been such a long time. Austria 2022, so to get that 6th Grand Prix win and to become our 4th winner of 2024 in 8 races, which I don't think anybody would have predicted going into the season, especially not after Bahrain. But yep, Leclerc and Ferrari looked like the most dominant package this weekend around Monaco's bumpy streets. On the Sainz side of the garage, things were a little trickier, struggling for confidence with the car, and he only really got it together with qualifying, which is the right time to get it together, considering how important that is at Monaco. So he qualified 3rd, finished 3rd. But yes, Ferrari on song this weekend, particularly for Leclerc.
Yeah, Ferrari and Leclerc were the class of the field all weekend. As Sainz put it best, Leclerc was in Q3 mode from the first laps of FP1. He was within 2/10 of the pace on the medium tyre when everyone else was on the soft, or at least the front runners were on the soft. He topped FP2 and FP3. But then the pace seemed to disappear a bit come Q1 and Q2, and there were a few worries that potentially it was a case of Ferrari's warm-up issues hampering it in qualifying once again. But Leclerc revealed a minor tweak pre-Q3, brought the pace back to him, and he put in 2 cracking laps to edge out Piastri. It was only a 10.5 between first and second, but when you see how tight the gaps were, I think there was a 10.5 between second and 7th, so a 10.5 at Monaco is more like 3-4 tenths potentially, a more conventional circuit. So Leclerc was absolutely on it in Q3 and well served pole position. Although the red flag took away any strategy they had to worry about, any red flags, he's had to survive 2 standing restarts, or one standing start and another standing restart. So it wasn't plain sailing for him. He did have those 2 moments of pressure to manage, and I think he managed the race expertly out front. You can say it's hard to overtake at Monaco and that the Piastri had damage, all the excuses in the book. At the end of the day, Leclerc kept it at the barriers. He controlled the pace, and I think we saw at the end how much pace he had in reserve, because he pulled out a 9-second gap in like 3-4 laps. He was cruising. He did what he needed to do, got the win, and I think anyone who criticises him for winning because the red flag took away any strategy is neglecting his great pole position and also the bad luck he's had in previous years. He fully deserved this. And I fully endorse what Fred Vasseur said, whereas I think we'll see a new Leclerc now. I think he's got that monkey off his back, and there'll be a Leclerc pre-Monaco and a Leclerc post-Monaco. And if Ferrari can keep developing on the baseline they've got, I still think they're behind McLaren and Red Bull on conventional circuits. I think Imola and Miami exposed it a little bit. That McLaren maybe just have that little edge on Ferrari. I think Carlos Sainz actually alluded to that. You can say there's a 0.5 tenth between McLaren and Ferrari, and then another 2 tenths to Red Bull. Will Ferrari find that little margin with the upgrades because they haven't dialed them in fully? Did they find something this weekend? I think Canada will tell us a lot, even though that's not a traditional circuit. Spain's going to be a big test for Ferrari because it's a testing circuit effectively. It is really a good indicator of how good your chassis is and just how good your car is in general. It's a smooth surface. We expect Red Bull to be strong there. High speed, medium speed corners, McLaren should be strong. If Ferrari can battle for the victory there, they can battle for the victory in most places. And the upgrades seem to have swung the balance in Leclerc's favour. And it's starting to remind me a little bit of 2022, where Leclerc really does have that momentum in his sails and is kind of leading Sainz by a decent margin. I think it's eight sessions in a row now, I think, including sprints since Sainz last beat Leclerc. So he's consistently on it. Only driver on the field to have top 4 finishes at every race. And it's that consistency and how this benchmark result in Monaco that have closed him right into championship contention.
Yes, it's a crazy thing to think about, isn't it? He's only 31 points behind Max Verstappen in the title picture after 8 races, which is, yeah, good. I think it's still probably inevitable. Well, maybe not that Verstappen ends up the title victor, but at least it's close. And obviously we talk about McLaren there as well, and we'll get onto them now. But first I just want to say, sort of, from my perspective personally, obviously growing up watching Formula 1 for the first time really properly in the early 2000s, to see a Ferrari-McLaren fight at the front in a race and then be the only 2 teams in contention for victory was quite nostalgic, which I'm sure it was for a lot of people, even going back further than the 2000s. Anyway, McLaren again looked quite good, as they have done for the past, I guess you could say, back to China, really. They've been on it, sporting their nice pop of colour with their Senna tribute livery, which grew and grew on me the longer I looked at it, actually. And I'll be sad to see it go, because it's a bit brighter than their carbon papaya number that they usually run with. Whereas Norris has been leading the charge for McLaren in recent races, winning in Miami, almost winning in Imola. It was Piastri's turn this time around, joining Leclerc on the front row and keeping the Ferrari driver honest until obviously that point you mentioned where Leclerc decided to check out at the end. But yeah, strong again from McLaren, being the best of the rest behind Ferrari, and a close best of the rest as well. Encouraging signs for them that they've been strong across 4 very different circuits in Shanghai, Miami, Imola, and now Monaco. And I think, like you say with Ferrari, the test coming up in, well, not an actual test, but figurative test coming up at Barcelona in 2 rounds' time, we're really going to see something interesting, I think, to see where McLaren sit in that picture with Ferrari and Red Bull.
Absolutely. I think, although they didn't get the win this weekend, McLaren can take a lot of positives out of it, because Monaco, on paper, slow speed corners, that's been their inherent weakness for many seasons. Norris did mention that actually Monaco is slightly different in the sense that it's not, it doesn't expose the limitations that McLaren have as much. I think Monaco's equally about how you can ride the curb and the bumps as it is how you manage the slow speed corners. And that's something they've obviously got a good handle on, not as good as Ferrari, but a solid handle on. And to be somewhat disappointed, I guess, with the 2nd and 4th shows the strides that they've made. You could argue actually they're the most consistent team at the moment. Red Bull had an off weekend, as we'll touch on later, whereas McLaren, as you mentioned, Dan, they've been good at 4 consecutive circuits now, and all very different circuit configurations, which bodes very, very well for them. This latest upgrade seems to have brought them on another substantial step. And if we recall last week's podcast, kind of previewing Monaco at the end, I said Piastri could be a dark horse, and there he was, leading McLaren up in 2nd. I had the feeling that his qualifying pace is a match for Norris, which is saying something, because Norris is now in his 6th season. Piastri's in his 2nd. Raw speed-wise, Piastri is more than a match for Norris. It's purely just that race management, which will come with experience, that he needs to gain. But that doesn't really factor in at Monaco, because its qualifying position is essential. He got the grid position, and then he managed the race behind Leclerc. And even at the end, when he was under a bit of pressure from Sainz, there was nowhere for Sainz to get through. So yeah, really mature drive from Piastri and fully deserved podium. Norris, 4th place on a suboptimal weekend, you could say. Again, not much to moan about.
Indeed. And I think there was the promise, wasn't there, of McLaren really charging this season after what they managed last year. And obviously, I think because of Red Bull's dominance, it was hard to see whether these teams like Ferrari and McLaren could really, bridge that gap to Red Bull. And it's very refreshing, I think, that we're now in a place where it looks like they have made decent strides into bridging that gap, and they're knocking on the door, they're putting pressure, and they're capitalising when Red Bull flounder. I mean, we look at the constructors' standings. McLaren on 184 points, so they've still got a ways to go to reclaim some points that perhaps they lost towards the start of the season. Ferrari 252 points, and Red Bull 276 points, so it's very, very close. And obviously Norris as well, he's having his best season to date, and he's third in the championship at the moment. But I'm going to double check that actually. He is third in the championship, 113 points. I should have had more faith in myself. But I know George Russell was next on the road behind the two McLarens, but I feel like we've been talking about them a lot. It makes more sense to talk about Red Bull next, who had an off weekend. And not an Imola off weekend where they rescue a pole position and a victory, but an off weekend. Singapore akin. Verstappen made a rare mistake trying to hustle his car in the final session of qualifying, touching the wall on the exit of turn 1. So he could only qualify 6th. And of course, that meant he finished in 6th because for the first time in F1 history, the top 10 finished where they started, which tells you all you need to know about this race. But we've talked about that at length. And we've also talked at length about Perez's struggles. Out in Q1, couldn't compensate the issues Red Bull were having over the bumps in the same way that Verstappen could, which again, I guess, it paints the picture of why the Constructors' Championship's close, because Perez is having a bit of a faltering moment, similar to he did last year in 2023. We're getting to the European leg of the season, and the promise that was shown in the earlier rounds is sort of fading for Perez. And I mean, there's talks that he's going to get his renewal, I guess, because Red Bull are happy with the balance and the harmony in their camp between the two drivers. But with that Constructors' Championship tightening, you really need Perez to step it up to make sure that they pull off another double championship at the end of the year. But yes, not a weekend that Red Bull, Verstappen and Perez are going to look back on fondly, and I'm sure they'll bounce back soon. Maybe not in Canada, but probably in Spain. But yeah, what did you make of the Champions weekend?
Yeah, make no mistake, Red Bull have still got the best car. And when we go to the European venues where, in more traditional circuits, I think we will see the RB20 stretch its legs again, and it'll be hard for McLaren and Ferrari to keep up. But this weekend has shown Red Bull are vulnerable. Their car doesn't absorb the bumps and the curbs as well as McLaren, or especially the Ferrari. That's been a prevalent weakness since 2022, since the ground effect cars came in, but Red Bull's dominance for the most part has been able to mask that. It was only really Singapore last year, where they also had difficulties with the setup, that kind of came to light for the first time, and it's been amplified here, probably in a greater way, just because Singapore was a blip in an otherwise flawless season. This is at the start of a season where Red Bull have looked shaky the last few rounds. They've not dialed the car in at Miami or Imola. They were fortunate at Imola that Max pulled out a worldly qualifying lap and managed to just pip Norris at the end in the race. But here there was no hiding, and although things looked promising as they developed in practice 3 and qualifying, that Max could be in contention for pole when it actually came down to it, him trying to do what he did in Imola and push and make that difference culminated in him hitting the barrier at the end of Q3 and actually dropping from 3rd down to 6th. If he had been 3rd, okay, take out what transpired with the red flag, starting 3rd. If he had started on those hard tyres there, or even on the mediums gone long and got like a overcut, because his race pace was actually quite good, he just couldn't use it. In practice, Red Bull race pace wide was okay. It's just their qualifying pace on the soft tyre on the lowest fuel just wasn't there to challenge Ferrari. And Verstappen trying to compensate for that made it worse. And then from 6th, there was nothing he could do. Perez, I was on the fence after Imola whether it was a dip in form or a blip, because I think it's very difficult to compare 2 seasons when the cars are different, even in a stable regulation cycle. It is concerning that this is now probably the 3rd season, you could say, 2022 to a lesser extent, where Red Bull have brought upgrades in and he's not been able to gel with the car. There's obviously something there where the car's behaviour is changing and he's not adapting to it in the same way that Max is. And although the Drivers' Championship I still think will be Verstappen's, because he's 31 points ahead with a DNF to his name, which he could have won in Australia, and you're looking at a 56-point gap, and nobody's talking about a championship challenging the drivers. As it is, he had that retirement. Leclerc's within a race win, or just over a race win, I should say. Canada next up, bumpy. You have to ride the curb, slightly different circuit in terms of it's more high speed. The Monaco you can overtake. I expect Ferrari to maybe go strong there. Then could challenge Red Bull and take more points out of Verstappen and get to within a race win. But focusing on the constructors, Red Bull desperately need Perez to regain some sort, not even some sort of momentum, just not end up in a spiral where he's struggling to get out of Q1 or Q2, because although he was unlucky to be in that incident at Turn 1, or the exit at Turn 1, he put himself in that position for his poor qualifying effort. And when the field's so tight over one lap, you need to be comfortable in the car, and right now he's not. And as Lando Norris said on Thursday, McLaren and Ferrari both have 2 drivers who operate on a similar level, and Red Bull constructors' chances are really in danger if Perez has another slump like he did last season.
Yes. I think, Canada is a big test for Perez, and he's going to need to step it up. I mean, when you were saying spiral there, I thought you were talking about his spiral in the race itself. But anyway, yes, I think it's a case just he needs to step up the qualifying, make sure he gets into Q3, make sure he's in the top 5 really in qualifying. But we'll see how he goes in Canada. Moving on to Mercedes now. Their best weekend of the year, mentioned by their drivers at different points in the weekend, I think we should add. Hamilton said it after Friday, after topping FP1, and I think he went 2nd in FP2. He went 3rd in FP3. And then in qualifying, he seemed to miss a step, and he was a few tenths back from his teammate and qualified 7th. Russell had the sort of inverse of Hamilton's weekend and sort of progressed as it went on and managed to qualify a respectable 5th and finish a respectable 5th. Mercedes in the race I found were very peculiar in the fact that they put their drivers onto the medium tyres after the red flag, and they had Russell managing his pace to such an extent that it created a free pit stop for the drivers in front essentially, or was close to doing so at varying points in the race. Much to the confusion of Verstappen and his engineer behind, who were curious as to why they were slowing down so much. And then there was more sort of strategy miscommunication in the Hamilton car when they attempted to undercut Verstappen. It didn't work. Verstappen stayed ahead when he pitted a lap later than Hamilton, and then Hamilton came over the radio going, "Why didn't you tell me the lap was critical?" Hamilton was a very demotivated figure, I found, in the sort of the latter half of the Monaco weekend. After qualifying, he was very dismayed. He was talking about how, every time he gets to a qualifying session, 2 temps seem to sort of escape from his car. He was under the impression that Russell's going to beat him in qualifying for the remainder of the year. He was kind of cryptic about why he felt that way. And then obviously there was that radio miscommunication in the race, which I believe you've written on the website that Toto Wolff has put that down to a team error. But one thing I noted listening to the F1 commentary from Alex Jakes, David Coulthard, Jolyon Palmer, they noted that, an outlap's critical. Like, that is, especially in the Monaco Grand Prix, that in-laps, outlaps are the times where you need to push. So does a 7-time world champion with 104 pole positions and 103 race victories need reminding? I think he desperately wants to get in that Ferrari, but there's a long way to go until then. But yes, progress for Mercedes, but obviously not enough to satisfy a team with their ambition. And be interesting to see whether they can push on from this.
Yeah, silver linings, I guess, for the silver cars. that the gap was narrowed in qualifying. They weren't far off the pace. They split a Red Bull. Max obviously touched on had the error, but they still capitalised, whereas in previous rounds they maybe wouldn't have done that. Hamilton's been around long enough. He's a wise operator. Those comments he made post-qualifying, regardless of whether he meant preferential treatment potentially, I don't think he did, but I think the way he worded it and how cryptic he was done on purpose to plant that suspicion. He's leaving the team. He doesn't, although in public he says he's indebted to Mercedes for what they've given him and he wants to help them out. I think deep down, when you're in his position and you're going and you're in the difficulties you are at the moment, that side to you will come out where he puts those comments that are a bit unnecessary. I mean, I think he was alluding to more than anything setting up for the race more than qualifying or angling more towards the race than qualifying, but he's put it in such a term that it's left suspicions which Toto will then had to diffuse post-race. He was asked about it, said Mercedes want both drivers to deliver at their best and give them equal opportunities and equal equipment, so that put that one to bed, and I don't think there's any reason to think Mercedes would intentionally sabotage Lewis Hamilton from delivering in his final season just to prove that George Russell has what it takes to lead the team in the future. I agree with you on the pit call, but I also think Mercedes were right to admit their error because of regardless of how much experience Hamilton has and how he should know and outlap's critical, he wasn't to know for definite that Red Bull were going to come in and cover off with Verstappen, so they should have been informing him there's a possibility that Verstappen would pit to try and get open up a better overtaking opportunity on Russell to push on that lap. So I think, although Hamilton should have known to push, I also think Mercedes could have communicated it way better, and that cost them a potential P5 and P6, but at the end of the day it's 2 points and it's not the end of the world. And I think the main thing for Mercedes to take away is that they are making progress, and I think although there's been so many false dawns and Toto Wolff has said there could be more setbacks to come because these cars are so sensitive, they do look like they have a clear direction now. It looks like they're tempering back those issues earlier in the season where they couldn't balance the high speed and the low speed. I think Monaco did, hide those deficiencies a little bit because all the corners are similar speed, so you're not having to balance high speed and low speed as you would on a traditional track. So it'll be interesting to see how they do go in somewhere like Canada and then Barcelona, but if they are right with this direction they've got and they're continuing to bring the upgrades, I think we could be really looking at a 4-team fight at the end of the season. Maybe not Mercedes on a par with those three ahead, but close enough to be there that on a good day or where the others falter, they can then pick up those positions, those podiums that they've not had so far this season.
Yes, I think time will tell just how good or how or how poor Mercedes' season is by the time we get to the end of it. I think they've got a lot of ground to cover, even if they are going in the right direction. But obviously I agree with you. Yeah, the team obviously had its part to play in that pit stop mishap. And that's another thing that Mercedes need to figure out, not only their car performance, but I feel like their operational performance isn't at the level it was when they were winning races and they were at the front. And arguably when you're in a position where you can't rely on the car performance to help you to race victories, those things really need to be on point and need to be operating at maximum efficiency. So that's something that they also need to work on. But moving on, behind the likes of Hamilton, the field was led by Yuki Tsunoda in the RB. Yuki's been having a fine patch of form recently and leading the Faenza-based outfit on all fronts. And I think that team is dangerously closing in on fifth place Aston Martin in terms of performance-wise. But yeah, Tsunoda had a very good weekend, in my opinion, getting it into Q3, then obviously just delivering what he needed to in the race. Danny Rick was missing a step off of his teammate in qualifying, struggled with the tyre warm-up in Q2, I believe he said was his issues, and he's still trying to find that consistency. We've seen flashes. Obviously, we saw the Miami sprint and got into Q3 at Imola as well, but still not the finished Danny Rick article that we've seen in the past. But overall, things are looking, I think, really promising for RB at the moment, and I think Aston Martin should be worried, because we'll get onto them later. They didn't have a good weekend for the second week in a row. So, yes, good things happening at RB. Good things happening at Williams. Albon into Q3 and in 9th place and picking up the team's first points of the year. So a lot to be happy with the Grove-based outfit. And they've become the 9th team to pick up points. Sauber the only team remaining. So a lot to be happy about there. Alpine we've sort of discussed, haven't we, with that first lap incident. Gasly obviously finishing in 10th to get his first point of the year. So another promising race for Alpine as they fight to become a midfield team again. Or I don't know what the ceiling is for them this year, but it's probably not much higher than 6th. But back on Williams, we had the revelation, obviously, that their car's overweight. It looks like they're going to be stripping some of that weight soon, so to get points now is really timely for them and good to see. I've grouped a bunch of teams there in a big gaggle, and I've waffled on quite a bit, so I'll hand the mic to you now, sir.
No worries. I think that's kind of our weekly segment where we group. It might as well be annual with the rate the season's going, but those 4 teams at the back of the field, I think on this occasion, because of how unique Monaco is and the chances that were provided with Aston faltering and Perez anonymous, they gave some of the backmarker teams the chance to score, and it was Tsunoda, Gasly and Albon that thrived in those conditions. Tsunoda, I mean, he's doing everything he can to put his name in the shop window. It doesn't look like Red Bull are keen on promoting him, or at least not for 2025. Whether he keeps up these performances long term, they then are convinced that he could be an option. Who knows whether he'll stick around for that. Talks are that he's kind of looking elsewhere to see what's outside the Red Bull program, which you can't really blame him. And then with Ricciardo, yeah, it's frustrating for him. It's frustrating watching him because I don't think it's like his McLaren spell. Yes, we had those glimpses of McLaren at Mexico, where he had a good weekend. We had the Monza win, but it never looked like he genuinely had the pace to beat Lando or be on Lando's level. Whereas I think his Miami performance and some of the sessions where he's been quick this year, there is underlying pace there. It's just not because of how sensitive the tyres are, how sensitive the cars are. When it comes to those crunch moments, he's not extracting it. And around Monaco, not doing that in qualifying punished you, and that left him vulnerable in the race. And Alonso was playing the team game to help Stroll, and he couldn't find a way through. And yeah, his race was over in qualifying. Albon kind of did what he did last year when openings were there. He took them. His lap in qualifying was sensational, I thought. He ran out of sync with everyone else in the middle of the Q3 to his one run. Huge pressure on that one run. I think our Williams' target was to beat the Alpine, and he did that. He got within 5/10 of the pole time when he originally set his time. So that was a fabulous effort and a much needed morale boost to Williams, because they have had a turgid start to the season with no points scored up to that race. And if they can cut the weight down, it kind of shows what they can do. It's easier said than done. It's not a short-term fix. It will take a few rounds, you imagine. But as we've done this blog many times, I think with Williams, it's one step back to go 2 steps forward. They have to do this car concept change to eradicate previous limitations. It's kind of made them relatively go backwards. But I think long term for 2025, and especially the new regulations, they're laying down some really good foundations. And obviously it transpired over the weekend that Carlos Sainz could be an option for them. Sargent's days look numbered. He had a pretty miserable weekend. Was that in Q1 again, but it wasn't entirely his own fault because he had older parts, and Albon suspects that with the newer parts he actually would have got through to Q2. Not that it would have made much of a difference, because as we saw with Ricciardo, when you get knocked out in Q2, the chance of points are pretty limited. But it still would have looked better than it did on paper for Sargent, whose time in F1 is shortly coming to an end. And I think if Williams can get Sainz, that would be a massive coup. Sainz Albon lineup would be really, really strong for them. And I think they've got a lot to look forward to in the future, even if the short term's a bit bleak at the moment. Alpine, yeah, as you said, they got the point. They maximised what they could do. I think it's good for Gasly to get off the mark. He's had a bit of a miserable season so far. He's been outpaced by Ocon. It was 7-1 the head-to-head going in, or 6-1, sorry, going into Monaco. So to get that point, get off the mark, and get on over on Ocon, I think was a good weekend's work for him. And it's a shame that Ocon's conduct kind of spoiled Gasly's result actually getting any headlines.
Yes. Yeah, I must admit, I was surprised when I saw the site's name in the Williams sort of discussions. But I think, I think we've spoken about it, and it's not a bad choice for him when you consider that the other option potentially is Sauber, who were just nowhere this weekend, completely sort of off. I felt like they were in a separate class in terms of their pace at Monaco this weekend, and they really couldn't have. I mean, Bottas obviously made some ground, and that was to do with, I think sort of tyre advantage and stuff like that at certain stages of the race. But yeah, if I was Sainz, I would definitely be picking Williams over Sauber, just because Sauber seemed to be a bit rudderless perhaps at the moment, and Audi are going to have a lot to do. I mean, we've spoken about this, so we don't really need to get into it, but Audi are going to have a lot to do when they take over. But yes, I think let's talk about Aston Martin. I don't think we need to talk about Haas, because their weekend was a write-off. Haas can pick things back up from where they left off, perhaps in other races in Canada. But Aston Martin, interesting times for them. Alonso out in Q1, and they were working well, I think, as a team in the race, with Alonso in 12th, backing up the field to allow Stroll to have a free pit stop. And it looked like potentially they might have a chance of pulling off another strategy masterclass like they did in Imola to salvage a point from the weekend, potentially. But when Stroll did his pit stop to get onto some fresher tyres and then potentially chase Gasly, it all came undone when he clipped the barriers at the chicane and got a puncture, which I guess was a nice sort of, not nice, but maybe a symbolic of Stroll as an F1 driver, not quite as consistent and as reliable as you would hope. But with Aston Martin piling on upgrades and seemingly not getting much benefit, it is a bit worrying for them, considering they started last year second fastest and slipped back due to the development race. This year they started fifth. They're still the fifth fastest, but there's threats from behind in the form of RB. If they really don't get their act together, it could end up being not a very positive 2024 for them, which would be a shame to see for a team that so far has been one on the up.
They must be so relieved that Alonso decided to renew in the wake of their kind of encouraging qualifying results at the start of the season, because then neither getting good qualifying results or good race results now. They just look like a team scrapping for a few points, and that's where they were in 2022 in the latter half of the season before Alonso arrived. So they just regressed to that point. And looking at the constructor standings, there's 20 points between Aston Martin and RB. If RB keep developing at the rate they have been since midway through last season, their Miami upgrade brought a sizable gain. It remains to be seen what Aston's upgrades have done, because they were meant to be a substantial step, or there was a lot of parts that they brought, and so far they've obviously not cracked the code on them, whether there's that potential there and they've not unlocked the setup for it, or whether it's the figures at the wind tunnel, the Mercedes wind tunnel that they use, aren't correlating with the on-track performance. That is a big thing, because if it's the latter, they're in serious trouble, and I could see RB even jumping them in the constructors, which, if Tsunoda keeps on at his current rate and Ricciardo can start unlocking that potential on a more consistent basis, you've got to say it's a realistic proposition, because we've seen the gulf there is between Alonso and Stroll, and I think you put it so well when you said this race epitomised Stroll. He went on to the mediums after Alonso made the gap. He made some good moves later on in the race as well. But then he had that just one moment where it's so easy to do around Monaco, but nobody else had an incident like that on their own. And yet it was Stroll who just carelessly turned in too early, tagged his rear, and it's so easy to do, but when it's Stroll doing it, or someone that's prone to mistakes, you can't really forgive it, because it did cost Aston Martin their hockey. It cost Alonso's race, because although Alonso wasn't going really anywhere fast, he sacrificed his entire race for Stroll, and that put it in the bin. And yeah, Aston's weekend could be summed up in how Alonso thought he was 10th the entire race after Stroll got his puncture, only to be told at the checker flag that he was 11th.
Not really the way they'd want things to end, not knowing where they finished. But yeah, hopefully they can pick things up soon, because I'm not sure Lawrence Stroll is going to be satisfied with them being a midfield team for much longer. So we'll end things there with Aston Martin pondering what they need to do to lift themselves back up the constructors' standing and the competitive order. Thank you once again for joining myself and Taylor as we talk about Formula 1, this time being the Monaco Grand Prix. We'll be looking ahead to the Canadian Grand Prix now in a fortnight's time, or just under a fortnight's time, and hopefully we can have some more surprises, maybe even another race winner. Perhaps Oscar Piastri will get his turn soon. Wouldn't that be nice? But there's other motorsport to enjoy before then. We have MotoGP heading to Mugello, we have Rally Italia Sardinia, we have IMSA and IndyCar at Detroit. So there's plenty to sink your teeth into at motorsportweek.com and our free-to-read digital magazine, Motorsport Monday, out every Monday. Of course, like, subscribe, listen to our podcasts. We're on Apple Podcasts, we're on Spotify, we're also on our YouTube channel at Motorsport Week, and you can follow us on all socials at Motorsport Week as well. X, formerly known as Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok. You can catch up with all our motorsport ramblings and wisdoms wherever you like, whatever corner of social media you find yourself in. But yes, until the next time, goodbye.